Hello，大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视这个频道。这期的热点深度继续关注中国火箭军。8月1日是中国的建军节，包括新华社在内的中国官媒都报道了国家主席、中央军委主席习近平日前视察中国的西部战区。习近平在7月26日到大陆的西部战区视察空军，并且向现场官兵发表重要的谈话。他强调要加强提高解放军现代化统筹航空兵部队向电子对抗等方向的发展，推动整体作战能力的提升。习近平还要求要加强解放军高层的领导能力，坚持以上率下从严要求，提高政治判断力、政治领悟力、政治执行力，提高领导备战打仗的能力。解放军报在8月1日建军96周年这一天以社评指出，世界进入新的动荡变革期，中国安全形势不稳定性、不确定性增大，要求加强军事力量常态化、多样化的运用，深入推进军事斗争准备，大抓实战化的军事训练。这篇社评强调全面加强练兵备战，坚定的灵活开展军事斗争，有效应对外部的军事挑衅，震慑台独分裂的势力，积极主动开辟军事斗争的新格局。针对此路透社有一篇报道就说，经过数月强化且日益雄心勃勃的力量投射演习之后，习近平在本周二中国人民解放军建军96周年纪念日前夕发表讲话，要求中国武装部队加快现代化进程。一些分析人士表示，这些举动反映了中国对美国及其盟国外部威胁增加的认识，并且北京正在展示其军事实力以传递政治信息。有中国分析人士宋忠平就说，原因很简单，世界不太平，中国面临的外部环境持续恶化。他说，中国演习的强度和频率不断增加，美国还在扩大地区部署，并加强与长期盟友和新朋友的关系。这引发了中国官员的呼吁，称如果要恢复两军的对话，华盛顿应避开中国的海岸。新加坡国立大学李光耀公共政策学院客座高级研究员德鲁·汤普森告诉路透社说，中国的演习其实更多代表一种政治信息，而不是军事信息。汤普森说，人民解放军所做的一切本质上都是政治性的。当中国军队进行演习时，它是在展示武力，它是在向其他国家传递信息。除了上面的讲话，社论，习近平在7月31日还为新任火箭军司令员王厚斌、政委徐锡胜晋升了上将军衔，几乎是证实此前疯传的火箭军前高层遭整肃清洗的传闻，让包括前中国国防部长魏凤和在内的历任火箭军及二炮司令受到一定程度的揣测与牵连。外界关于火箭军肃清有许多的猜测和传闻。在去年10月份，2022年的10月，中国国家主席习近平确定连任之后，美国空军大学下属的中国航空航天研究所 CASI 曾发布了一份内容庞大的中国火箭军报告书，报告书足足有255页，内容是涵盖火箭军组织构成、各级部队指挥官、主要干部姓名和照片、火箭军基地位置、部署的导弹类型和战斗力评价等等。美国智库这份报告从中国火箭军各单位的指挥官是谁、驻地地址到经纬度坐标都一一掌握，并且是完全公开。这份报告的作者，中国航空航天研究所所长马伟宁在接受媒体自由亚洲采访时就说，这确是目前为止公开发表的最具综合性的有关火箭军组织结构的报告。他说，这个报告全部是基于公开信息。他对中国人民解放军火箭军在中央军委主席习近平领导下的扩张给出了非常具体的信息。当时另外一家媒体新头壳的相关报道还提到，马伟宁又提到，报告中最重要的资讯是火箭军的严格非导弹部队的扩张，还有此部队掌控的各类导弹的数量、品质以及类型的增长。在这份视频的后半段，我们来根据这份报告书看看中国的火箭军几个重要的导弹基地。第一个就是位于黄山的61基地。该报告指出，火箭军位于安徽省黄山的61基地驻地，其作战地域覆盖中国东南部地区，且该基地在接近台湾海峡前线部署了大量的短程弹道导弹。这也意味着一旦台海开战，这个基地将成为对台发动空袭的主力。61基地根据这份报告书有8个旅，还有及训练团、通信团、作战保障团、综合保障团、技术勤务旅、装检团、无人机团、96601部队医院。报告指出，该基地毗邻 台湾海峡的作战区域，表明将成为在冲突中负责弹道导弹行动的主要基地。另外，基地还有一个特殊的支持系统，有一个旅负责测试和运输大量短程常规导弹以及自己的无人机团。这个报告还说，61基地还能指挥一个位于浙江东阳的无人机队的驻地。尽管该机队的公开信息目前极少，但其部署位置恐代表它将执行台海冲突中的战术侦察、目标定位及损害评估的任务。除了锁定台湾的短程导弹之外，61基地近年也接收了射程更远且配备核弹头的东风21A 中程弹道导弹，更可能进一步配备改进型的东风31弹道导弹。而关于这个61基地相关的资料，其实在网上并不少见，你搜一搜也能搜到。比如在2014年，新浪军事上就有一篇文章，标题就是俄罗斯的媒体详细披露二炮部署，中国军区辖7个旅，数量第一。这个报道就说到中国的核武器在各军兵种之间的分配情况，主要是基于多为猜测的已知数据。除了俄罗斯之外，只有中国把大部分的战略核力量划归独立军种。在中国人民解放军，这个军种叫二炮或第二炮兵，这也可以显示出这是一个有年代的文章了。文章说，类似于俄罗斯的战略火箭兵，主要是配备编制为陆基战略核力量。中国对二炮的消息是完全保密，传统上不提供有关导弹和弹头数量的任何官方数据。从各种渠道却可以得知，二炮编有6个导弹集团军，也就是导弹基地。除了北京的军区之外，其他军区境内各部署1个，每个集团军基地下辖几个旅，每个旅装备一种类型的导弹，各辖3至6个导弹营，每个营下辖3个导弹连，每个连各辖3个导弹排。一套发射装置配置1个连或者是1个排，具体情况是导弹的类型而定，因此一个导弹旅可能拥有9到54套发射装置。导弹的数量可能多于发射装置的数量，通常多出20%至25%。北京军区境内有为二炮建有纵横交错的地下隧道系统，可以隐藏任意数量的发射装置，特别是机动发射装置以及导弹和弹头。但是在此方面，在当时没有任何哪怕较为接近的情报，因此下面只能探讨有多少点消息的6个导弹基地。在后面的文章中更是提到位于南京军区的第52基地，这个52基地也是61基地的前身。这个52基地下辖第807旅，管理的是东风21弹道导弹；811旅管理的是东风21弹道导弹；815旅东风的15B 弹道导弹；817旅管理的是东风15弹道导弹；818旅管理的是东风11A 弹道导弹，还有819旅管理的是东风15弹道导弹和820旅东风15弹道导弹。改制前的这个南京军区有7个旅，数量位列整个中国军区的第一，这还是近10年前就被公布出的资料。所以说中国火箭军报告作者的说，资料都来源自公开的资料，这个可信度可能还是有的。后面我们也会择机为大家带来这份报告里更多更详细的内容。好了，以上就是今天热点深度的所有内容。更多资讯可以关注6度简报网站，网址是6度brief.com， 在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个节目再见。
文案中，被党国体制绑架的中国经济正失去百年不遇的现代化机会。中国经济遇到一个要不要让要素市场发育出来的死结，只要这个死结无法解决，中国也就无法实现2个弥合，无法实现将广大农民和农民工包含在内的全面现代化。中共已经意识到，在自己的治下，这种意义上的现代化遥不可及，正在推出所谓的中国式现代化道路的神话。可以断言，就像当年的人民公社道路，后来的农村工业化道路，以及在后来的华西村、南街村道路那样，不管一时被吹得如何天花乱坠，都已一一破产一样，中国式的现代化道路也将作为一个自说自话的反市场、反宪政民主的笑话载入人类的史册。1、中国经济增速急剧趋缓的2大根本原因。随着对超级全球化的幻灭，经济全球化的荣景不再。各国对经济全球化及部分制度和意识形态加深和加广国际分工所带来的风险变得疑虑重重，纷纷改用价值和社会经济制度是否同类作为抱团取暖、深化分工、加深依赖的主要考虑。 经济全球化正向独裁联盟和民主联盟为标志的阵营化蜕变，低端贸易仍在跨阵营进行，算是超级全球化的残留痕迹，也使本世纪的这次冷战有别于上世纪的那次。但是，以尖端芯片和高级 AI 技术为代表，这些通往未来世界的最重要的钥匙，已经在对独裁国家的禁运名单上赫然位列首位。高科技的全面脱钩已势在必行。本来一直被虚情假意掩盖着的，对全球化终极愿景的根本分歧，已经图穷而匕首见。领导着第二大经济体的中共，已向世界声明，要回到共产党宣言的目标，建立党国体制，消灭私有制。面对抱有如此初衷和最终目标的对手，发达市场经济国家自然放弃和平演变的幻想，不会继续一厢情愿地假装糊涂，愚蠢地帮助缔造一个旨在消灭自身制度的强大帝国。发达国家痛苦地意识到，党国体制虽然无法造福广大民众，却可以将百姓的福祉压在最低的生存线上，集中余下的财力、物力，通过产业政策和管控，单边穷尽规模报酬递增的增益，以便扩军备战，夺取世界主导权，实现共产党宣言的宏伟目标。出于对中国这种单边做法的担心，发达国家正在对中国减少单边开放市场和科技，同时，中国自己又已拒绝尽快发育出要素市场，等于拒绝了彻底的市场导向的改革，因为是否存在充分发育的要素市场，是市场经济机制的核心部分和主要特征。上述两大原因的叠加影响，使中国一度令人炫目的高速增长不见了踪影。包括发达国家元首在内的高朋满座、共襄盛举的宏伟景象，已成往日的追忆。亚非拉穷兄弟们虽然脸上还挂着笑脸，手中却举着长长的抢求援助的清单，随时可从朋友转为敌人。一带一路债台高筑，暴露了中共好大喜功、打肿脸蛋充胖子的传统。由于几乎每个项目都缺乏科学的可行性研究，已令有识之士纷纷担心一带一路是否可以持久，中共的这一充满企图心的跨国工程是否会成为14亿国人的沉重负担，以及参与国的债务陷阱。为中国奇迹做出了最大体力贡献的农民工，原以为献出了青春岁月之后，打工所在的城市会善待自己的晚年，至少会善待自己的后代。不料这些城市继续拒绝他们落户，拒绝让他们转为正式市民，实现家庭团聚的美梦。雪上加霜的是，随着外企的陆续撤离，民企面对党国体制的蛮横收编，变得气息奄奄、灰头土脸，农民工的就业前景已经变得十分暗淡。这群中国奇迹的创造者，在党国体制下，原来不过是内定的被驱赶回乡的低端人口。令人更为气绝的是，他们的后代是否还有步自己的后尘，进城出卖体力的同样好运，也在未定之天。所谓改革开放会使一代比一代的日子过得更加美好的最起码的愿望，看来将成一枕空梦。官方媒体开始将发达国家的民众描写成正在饥饿交迫之中苦苦挣扎，是否想使中国民众至少感到生活于党国的一丝幸运？不过同时，官媒又要求民众对未来的惊涛骇浪和艰苦日子做最坏的思想准备，同样使人愕然。仔细想来，这也许是官媒好不容易说出来的几句老实话，值得认真对待，说明中国经济前景确实不妙，已经到了官媒也不得不吐真言的地步。本来是各大都市抢夺对象的应届毕业生和小白领，由于在党国体制下本国科技缺乏创新活力，国外的科技创新源头又被逐渐掐断，产业难以升级换代，后面的国家又在纷纷追赶上来，中国自身不上不下，两头受挤，所谓一枝独秀已成昨日黄花。这自然是自称的新时代过高估计自己的实力，为了阻止中国向民主自由前进，损害党的垄断权力，不惜与世界翻脸的又一例证。在严峻的就业形势下，许多人毕业即失业，只能窝在家中啃老，使这些家庭的实际生活水平每况愈下。难怪越来越多的年轻人没有显示出活力四射、青春如火的蓬勃朝气，而是选择放弃内卷，彻底躺平，不顾中共描写的千年盛世的频频招手，悲壮地准备做最后一代。还有更加浓黑的阴影笼罩着中国经济，那就是巨大的房市泡沫和沉重的地方债务这两个不定时炸弹。万一引爆，中国乃至世界将被拖下金融危机的深渊。难怪连美国财长耶伦在他最近的北京饭局上也忧心忡忡，因为届时位于大洋对岸的美国都无法从中国的金融狂澜中置身事外。人们不禁要问，房市泡沫带来的财富幻觉一旦破灭，中产阶级会逆来顺受，接受生活无着的悲惨命运，还是加入农民工的行列，构成对中共当局的巨大挑战？由于中国的各种经济指标几乎没有亮点，反而潜伏着各种灰犀牛和黑天鹅，安全，安全， 安全这两个字已经成为当局最常用的词汇，反映出他们最大的心病。不过短短几年，一个自称已经进入千年盛世的厉害国，为了安全两字变得如此惶惶不可终日，令人有恍若隔世之感。2. 发展中国家实现现代化的主要标志。印度总理对普京直言不讳地说，21世纪不是一个发动战争的年代。这句话说得太好。在超级全球化最鼎盛的时期，谁能料到，在欧洲这块文明而发达的大地上，俄乌两国的军队会用先进武器激烈对阵，造成生灵涂炭、财产毁灭，而且处于劣势的俄国侵略者会屡屡发出用核弹毁灭全球的威胁。如果说俄国从来没有专心于经济发展，却醉心于领土扩张的话，那么至少在过去几十年中，中国是一直专注于经济改革和经济发展的，并一再向世人论证中国的崛起必定为和平的。为何中国和发达国家也走上了反目为仇的道路呢？这就要说到发展经济的最终目的。要有持久的世界和平和繁荣，发展经济的目的绝不是为了将来有一天能够穷兵黩武、扩军备战，或为了证明某种主义为宇宙真理，或某个政党的一贯光荣、伟大、正确，或让领袖可以不顾本国民众的幸福，去充当世界的英明领袖。发展经济的目的在于让本国全体人民的生活不断改善，使他们的下一代过上更加人道、文明、公正、公平和富裕的生活，享受更多的自由和民主权利，并能和世界各国人民更加和睦的、自由自在的交流和来往，分享人类的一切文明和科技成果。发展中国家必须牢记，他们的起点很低，人口的大部分是传统小农，生活于极端的贫困、落后和愚昧之中。这样的国家判断自己的经济发展是否踏上了正途，还是走上了邪路，不在于反帝、反殖民主义的口号如何响彻云霄，更不在于提出虚无缥缈的反对私有、实行公有、实现共同富裕这类乌托邦诺言。不管这类口号如何美丽，诺言如何迷魂，其实已经脱离了时代的本质。当今时代已经不是反帝、反殖的时代。这个时代随着联合国宪章的确立，殖民地的全部独立已经结束。当今世界，各国应该关注如何让本国的广大小农人口获得市民的同等权利，使他们能自愿地脱离效率低下的小农经济，加入到高效率的现代化的生产方式中去。这些国家必须做到2个缩小乃至弥合，才能说自己实现了现代化。第一，必须缩小乃至弥合本国的城市人口和发达国家之间的收入差距。第二，本国的农村人口能够逐渐缩小乃至弥合与本国城市人口之间的收入鸿沟。2个弥合主要通过工业化和城市化来实现。2个弥合的实现是发展中国家实现经济学意义上的现代化的最主要标志。各国的实践表明，要达成这一目标，单纯的发号施令或提出一厢情愿的愿望、许诺或发誓、赌咒都没有丝毫用处。发达国家之所以能成为发达国家，是因为建立了市场机制，主要是通过要素市场的激励和引导，加上一系列与市场机制配套的制度、法律，决定性的配置资源，才能完成由传统的农本经济过渡到现代经济。如果只知道心血来潮、发号施令，在结束了殖民时代之后，仍然将本国经济的问题归咎于殖民时代的不公正，拒绝改革自己的经济和政治制度，这样的国家即使有发展经济的强烈愿望，也只会迎来梦想的一再破灭。这些国家应该看到，发达国家在放弃了所有的殖民地之后，反而变得更加发达、更加富裕。东亚各国在最近几十年里崛起成为发达国家，并没有依靠殖民和征服。中国在过去几十年中的高速增长，也是依靠市场机制，和平地参与到国际分工中去的结果。可以预言，由于俄国拒绝深化市场导向的改革，反而不听各国忠告，走上殖民和征服的老路，必将使俄国加速走向衰败和没落。而且，由于中央计划经济在所有国家的惨败，各国只能借助市场机制的配置和引导。3. 来自中国自身的正反经验。从1949年开始，中共按照共产党宣言的理念，迫使社会沿着一条扼杀市场机制、扼杀亿万民众在改善生活、增加收入方面所呈现的自发性和首创性的邪路急速倒退。具体来讲，在城市，中共强迫赎买资本家的企业，将工人变为没有人权和自由选择的工奴。在农村，中共用谎言和暴力剥夺了所有农民的土地，使他们全体沦为没有产权、无权掌握自己产品的农奴。中共将民间一切财富收归国有后，将他们纳入计划经济的桎梏，置于集权的控制之下。其结果，中国沦为世界上最穷的国家之一，与世界各国的收入差距和技术差距越来越大。 作为现代化主要标志的城市化率甚至发生了倒退。大批知识青年被迫离开父母，到边远和贫困的农村从事最原始的农业生产，造成极大的效率损失。中共执政的前30年对中国百姓的福祉来说，是中央计划经济的一场极为失败的试验，不啻于一场巨大的灾难。正因为党国体制下计划经济是一场灾难，1978年当局决定走一条不同于计划经济的道路。一开始犹犹豫豫的当局准备走南斯拉夫的混合经济道路，结果不久南斯拉夫自己抛弃了这条死胡同。于是1990年代初开始，中国决定继续走开始于1980年代的市场导向的改革道路。长期生活于农奴制下的广大农村人口从人民公社的桎梏中解放出来，不但获得了对土地的使用权，还获得了离开农业进入非农产业打工的权利。同时，随着50万家国营工厂的私有，沉睡其中的各种要素被解放出来，巨量的劳动、资本和土地要素获得自由之后，客观上构成巨大的供给能力，使中国迅速成了世界工厂。这里的关键是，这种供给能力并非是盲目形成的。尽管中国本身并没有发育出要素市场，但是世界上存在着要素市场，通过世界市场的价格引导着中国生产要素的重新配置，以满足世界市场上由于各国单边开放所带来的巨大需求。中国加入 WTO 后，欧、美、日市场并没有要求中国立即对等地开放自己的市场，这也许是一种错误，使中国陷入杨小凯生前警告过的后发劣势中去。既然来自欧美日市场的需求是现成的、成熟的、有效的，供需双方的结合，使双方都大大受益的同时，也使中国失去压力，不再进一步做关键性的制度改革，便能坐收全球化的红利。这是从1980年代起，经济增长率长期维持在平均 9% 的高水平上，有时甚至高达10%几的主要原因。作为由传统社会向现代社会转型的标志之一的城市化率，从改开初期低于 20%， 迅速上升到 40% 以上。若按官方的口径，将没有城市户籍的农民工群体作为城市常住人口计算的话，则目前的城市化率甚至达到 60% 左右。这可以说是一个当代的奇迹。4. 全球化的倒退，要素市场发育的受尽，使中国百年未遇的现代化良机正在远逝。中国拥有巨大的过剩人口，却有极度恶化的生态，各项最主要的人均资源占有量也极度贫瘠。这说明中国离开世界，离开发达国家的巨大市场，离开发达国家的科技活力，要想主要依靠内循环，现代化的实现是一项不可能的任务。对中国经济增速会逐渐下降，经济学家在10年以前早有共识。这是因为只要没有进一步的市场化改革和相应的政治改革，允许中国经济进一步融入全球经济，中国经济的高速增长一定会遇到各种瓶颈而无法继续。反过来，这也意味着如果沿着市场导向的改革开放的路子走下去，世界本来会欢迎中国尽快发育出要素市场，欢迎中国以自身健全的市场机制继续深化与世界各国的分工合作，使中国经济增长在相当长的时期内维持一定的势头。最重要的是，只要中国继续扩大与国际的全面接轨，彻底融入世界经济，从1980年代开始的中国城市化奇迹就能延续下去，将有更多的农民和农民工吸收到城市中去，使本来依靠小农生产方式谋生的农村人口得以继续转移到生产力更高的城市现代部门，实现上述的2个弥合。借助改革开放，让世界帮助中国消化巨大的过剩人口，帮助提高农村人口的收入水平，乃至全体国人的收入水平，弥合与发达国家的收入差距，这是100年来中国遇到过的最好的机会，反映了人民的呼声、人民的愿望、人民的梦想。可是，这种100年未遇的机会已经被中共的自私和贪婪所断送。自从中国进入以重新大力建立党国体制为特征的新时代后，经济增长率一路走低，目前已经降低到 5% 以下。由于强硬谋求党国体制的进一步加固，中国和几乎所有奉行民主体制的发达国家的关系变得疏远，如果不是对立的话。在党国体制下，中共用共产党宣言的理念作为继续骗人的幌子，扼杀了按市场经济的要求尽快发育出要素市场的可能性。在没有要素市场决定性配置资源的情况下，名义上是政府在做决定性的资源配置，实质上由于强调党领导一切，资源的决定性配置自然变成党的特权，并为党的战略目标服务，而不是旨在改善民众，特别是中下阶层的福利。由于没有市场的供求双方产生的均衡价格的信号，党对资源的配置只能是瞎指挥，全凭心血来潮。新时代不过将九龙治水， 政出多门变成定于一尊而已，却更加朝令夕改，前后矛盾，没有任何制衡，唯有谄媚和奉迎。可以预见，只要党国体制继续主宰资源的配置，不但中国的城市中产阶级与发达国家的收入差难以弥合，而且由于城市化率面临倒退，农民工和广大农民的收入也难以提高，使城乡收入差的鸿沟继续扩大。只要两个弥合难以实现，中国百年未遇的全面现代化的机会必定离中国远去。在这里，我们又一次看到党的利益和人民的利益的赤裸裸的背离。发育要素市场必然会使党在经济活动中寻租的权利越来越小，而针对党的瞎指挥导致的市场失灵、侵害企业和民众利益的追责却会越来越严厉，使得党在资源配置中越来越显得多余，显得有害。如此一来，随着要素市场的充分发育，随着党干扰经济、破坏市场的真面目的暴露，党必然被人民和企业所唾弃，最终被彻底边缘化。这本来对中国经济的发展是头等好事，对人民的幸福来说也是头等好事。但是对一心寻求凌驾于法律和宪法之上，享受特权的中共来说是绝不甘心的。为了拯救中共的执政安全，中共的保守派只能强行扼杀要素市场的发育，开改革开放的倒车。现在为了挽回民企和民众的信心，出台了民企31条，好话说尽，却回避一系列要害问题，即中共究竟让不让要素市场发育出来，究竟让不让民企享有国企的同等待遇，对于为了让国企做大做强而不惜动用国库，给予他们的种种优惠和特权，民企究竟能不能同等而自动的享受？经济增长和收入分配的决定性作用究竟能不能还给市场？显然，这是中共保守派最感害怕的问题。难怪31条完全回避。所以，中国经济遇到一个要不要让要素市场发育出来的死结。只要这个死结无法解决，中国也就无法实现两个弥合，无法实现将广大农民和农民工包含在内的全面现代化。中共已经意识到，在自己的治下，这种意义上的现代化遥不可及，正在推出所谓的中国式现代化道路的神话。可以断言，就像当年的人民公社道路，后来的农村工业化道路，以及在后来的华西村、南街村道路那样，不管一时被吹得如何天花乱坠，都已一一破产一样，中国式的现代化道路也将作为一个自说自话的反市场、反宪政民主的笑话载入人类的史册。作者文冠中，美国三一学院经济系荣休教授，2023年7月27日在《未来中国向何处去》国际研讨会上的发言。
Never a good sign. Yep. Employee satisfaction was at an all-time low, especially way up high. But to be fair, Gu Shenzhang, a book about him in Chinese is Gu Shenzhang, the most dangerous traitor in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. Gu Shenzhang was caught in Wuhan and was given the choice. We can torture you to death, or you can come over to our side. Now, some communists made the choice of the former, but Gu Shenzhang decided on the latter. And here we have a very interesting incident that tells us something about Zhou Enlai. Because when Gu Shenzhang defected in Wuhan, he begged his captors to rescue my family. They're in Shanghai. They're going to be killed by the communists. They were a little bit slow at that. And Zhou Enlai coordinated the effort to murder the entire family, minus one baby who was left alive. And their bodies were buried under the bricks in some place in Shanghai, and was only discovered when the smell became too strong. Anyway, after that, things kind of fell apart in the cities. Their networks were largely rounded up by the nationalists. And indeed, if you look at some statistics that are put out by the nationalists, in 1931, they caught several thousand people. In 1932, they caught twice as many people. These are communists in general, Communist Party members in general, but also a lot of spies. So by 1935, the Chinese Communist Party decided it had to abolish their organization that they had started, which was called the Special Services Section. And it all reverted to the control of the people in the Red Army area in Jiangxi, because this is where everybody fled to, who could flee anyway. That included some major figures in CCP intelligence, including Li Kenong, who went on to become the leader of PRC intelligence after 1949. But they recovered, partly in thanks to a vile and reviled figure, Kang Sheng, who was brought back to China by Stalin. He had been in Moscow as a delegate to the International. He was brought back, and he was a good organizer. He was also a bastard. He was responsible for carrying out Mao's orders to purge the party during the rectification period in 1942 to 44.
I love this detail you have where at some point in 1943, Stalin sends Mao a letter saying, you're overdoing it on the purging. And, if you receive that letter from Stalin, you probably might want to reconsider just how many spies you're actually going to end up catching when you squeeze the lifeblood out of your organization.
Yeah, and at that point, too, Mao was getting ready to purge a lot of people in the inner circle, including Zhou Enlai himself and other figures like Bo Gu. So, yes, Stalin decided to crack the whip, and Mao felt he had no choice but to stop, and there was widespread dissatisfaction and even outrage in the party in Yan'an. And Mao actually apologized in several meetings for the conduct of the rectification campaign and the part that was within it that was really crazy, the salvation campaign. So after that, Kang Sheng's star was no longer so high in the sky. Eventually, he was relieved.
Let's not forget also that Stalin saved Mao's butt again by persuading him not to kill Chiang Kai-shek when he had him captured in the Xi'an incident, which, would have probably led to the Japanese just taking over the entire country and wiping out the CCP whole hog.
That's one of those what-if scenarios that's very fascinating. Yes, I agree that would have been a major risk had he done that. Yeah, Mao wanted to put Chiang Kai-shek on trial and then have a quick execution, but it didn't work out that way. And of course, Stalin's interest was less saving Mao's butt than it was keeping the Japanese out of Siberia. In other words, keeping them tied down in China. A very difficult situation. One of the things that fascinates me about these early revolutionaries is what tough boys and girls they were. At very young ages, they were doing crazy things. Now, if I wouldn't want to compare them to the greatest generation that we have, like we like to say in the United States, but they went through enormous hardships and crazy sacrifices.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about like the life of, Washington and Hamilton and Adams, who basically lived like gentlemen throughout the entirety of the Revolutionary War. Whereas the sort of 15-year arc that Mao and co went through on their path to power. So, what do you think the sort of imprints of all this sort of skullduggery in those 15 years, or actually all the way up to 1949, where they finally emerged on top?
Well, one of the lessons was that you have to keep purging. They were purging themselves at Mao's behest throughout the revolution, starting in earnest in 1931 with the so-called Futian incident, which was really a series of problems in that area in Jiangxi, where Mao was waging war against people who did not accept him as the supreme leader of the movement. And a lot of people were killed. His intelligence organization that he had there, which was a military intelligence / purge organization, was very key in carrying out a lot of these executions and purges. And digging out traitors continued to be an emphasis with the CCP under Mao. It paused for a bit when Mao was displaced just before the Long March. But of course, during the Long March at the Zuni conference in late 1934, things changed because the consensus was that the military strategy up to that point had failed. We're being slaughtered. We need to go back to a guerrilla warfare type approach. And Mao went out there, and he didn't become the supreme leader there. His star simply rose back to where it had been. But the path was set for him to displace his enemies through further purges that just continued and continued until 1944.
How important were spies to the CCP's victory in the Civil War?
The Civil War was almost CCP espionage 2.0, because the big purges were over with. Mao had tried his flirtation with the Americans. The Dixie Mission is familiar to a lot of people. In 1944, right after being scolded by Stalin, Mao was hoping to get the Americans to commit to supplying weapons to fight the Japanese, and indeed really to fight the Kuomintang once the Japanese were defeated, therefore reducing his reliance on Russia. But that didn't really work out. So the emphasis then was on leaning to one side eventually, with leaning toward Moscow. But also purges were done, and for the moment anyway, and they focused on getting back to basics when it came to espionage. Lee Canong, for example, now, of course, the Japanese surrender in September of 1945 was a bit of a surprise that it came so quickly. And so, of course, the nationalists and the communists raced to occupy Japanese occupied cities and areas throughout the country. And in order to continue the struggle along those lines, they needed more spies inside the KMT. And Lee Canong dragooned a lot of people who had been sitting comfortably behind the lines, being ideologically correct, into going into a more hazardous occupation of being an undercover spy with a secret radio and all that kind of thing, and developing networks and so on. And it worked. By the time that the nationalists retreated, really by the time of 1948, when inflation took off, something else that had taken off was communist spies within the KMT and within their army. And it's difficult to measure how important that was, but it was obviously crucial to their victory.
Sure. Yeah, and there are different reports of the generals telling them where they're going to march and, potentially killing their own people because they were so dedicated. I mean, sending their own troops into harm's way because of their commitment to the CCP cause, which is a pretty remarkable accomplishment if you're Zhou Enlai.
Yeah, I think Chiang Kai-shek's quote in his memoirs was, "There was no space they did not enter."
Yeah. So one other character which played a pretty fascinating role is Song Qingling, Madame Sun Yat-sen, over the course of this period. So how did she contribute to these efforts?
Well, she was an agent runner's dream, really. She was so well placed, and she had such a Teflon exterior, maybe not Teflon, but she was so unassailable. She could not be arrested, tortured, and disappeared or anything like that, because she was the symbol of the original revolutionary movement. So she fled China, actually, to get away from the nationalists in the early 30s, which was planned by an interesting character, this Reina Promi, I think her name was, an American communist who was one of her confidential secretaries. But to get back to the main point, she was in Moscow for several years and then returned to China when the war was about to pick up with Japan. And she lived in Chongqing. She lived in Shanghai first, Chongqing later. And she was somebody who all the foreigners wanted to meet, certainly.
Fluent English, of course. Went to Wellesley, I guess.
Fluent in English, absolutely. And she was also a social and societal figure sought out by practically all Chinese. It would be really interesting to know more and to see documents and know more about what she actually did. But the things that we do know she did included meeting CCP agents, passing along code books, and spotting and assessing people. So among those that she spotted and assessed and reported on were Edgar Snow in 1934-35, and George Hatem, Dr. Ma Haide. So she assessed and reported on them and passed them along to communist agents who took them, they traveled together, took them to Bao'an, which was the pre-Yan'an, of course. Yan'an was not occupied by the communists until after the war started with Japan, and they negotiated that with the nationalists. And, of course, that led to what I would call the CCP's first international influence operation of great success, the book Red Star Over China.
Of course. Song Qingling's house you can visit in Beijing. It's right off Hohai. And I mean, she's worth a whole podcast in and of herself. She married Sun Yat-sen because she wanted to be involved in politics. And this was the way to do that if you're an active woman in, 1910. And what a remarkable life. But anyways.
Yeah, and she didn't become a communist until she was on her deathbed. Her cover, if you will, to maintain international credibility, both for her and for the Communist Party, so that we could show that we are not just a single monolithic party. We have the cooperation of other elements of society. Her cover was to be a non-communist, but she, of course, was thoroughly into the communist cause.
So, okay, congratulations, Mao. You did it, 1949. Let's take us up to the Cultural Revolution. So how did things go for the spies in this period?
That was very difficult, but I want to briefly comment on the interim. So China went through a period of, again, lots of purges, looking for enemies within, and indeed there were plenty of enemies within. There were leftover Kuomintang troops and spies and bureaucrats and so forth. And they were dug out during numerous campaigns starting in 1950. The Korean War against America didn't help and with that spirit very much, of course. But during this time, the intelligence agencies, it took a while to start their foreign intelligence agency, the investigations department, for different reasons, partly the Korean War, partly illness of Lee Ka-nong, who was recognized by everyone as the person who should lead that effort. But he nonetheless led a scattered effort throughout several agencies, including the military before that. And then interagency coordination and standards building began in earnest and continued all the way up until the Cultural Revolution. Lee Ka-nong fell and had I think it was an aneurysm. But anyway, he was disabled for the rest of his life after 1957 when he had that accident, which was damage to his brain. And in 1962, he died. But he was succeeded by people from the revolution, notably Kong Yuan, a longtime revolutionary, and the man who was married in a double wedding ceremony with Deng Xiaoping and his wife. But when the Cultural Revolution comes along, these people are all targets. Now, why on earth would Mao Zedong want to target these people? That is a question.
He gave a bad toast at Deng's wedding, clearly.
You never know. If only we had the transcripts. But the crux of the matter seems to be that the far leftists believed that there was all sorts of evidence against people they wanted to target, held by the investigations department. And so one of the first things that happened was that, just like every other bureaucracy in the Communist Party, in the PRC government, factions, Red Guard factions, immediately arose. And they started fighting over whether or not, first arguing, then fighting over whether or not to release what Jiang Qing, the leader of the left, called black materials. And these black materials partly were black materials that showed that she was not a very diligent revolutionary herself, things she wanted to suppress. But she was, in the main, looking for evidence against people that she wanted to do away with for various reasons, including not being totally on side with Mao's leftist program and her support of it.
Before we go on. So in the purges, I love how there was some guy who used Shenmi Zhuyi. So like mysticism as a way to find spies, which is never really a good sign for the professionalism of your intelligence organization when this is what you're falling back on. So Matt, let's talk about Shenmi Zhuyi, or the mysticism strategy when it comes to unearthing spies within the ranks.
Okay. That started, it would seem, with Kang Sheng himself during the rectification campaign, and in particular the Salvation Campaign of 1943. So in the beginning of the rectification campaign in 1942, Kang claimed that he could sniff out a spy, he could talk to somebody and know whether or not they were a spy. He didn't claim Shenmi Zhuyi or anything. He didn't claim mysticism, but he claimed that he could tell that a person was a spy simply by spending a little bit of time with them, shaking their hand and so forth. So that led to a lot of arrests. There's a famous line that Kang Sheng said to Li Rui, Mao's former secretary. He wrote about this. Kang Sheng said that we won't need evidence, because Li Rui said, what evidence do we have against these people you're accusing of being spies? We won't have evidence. We will have their confessions. There's a great line, if you've ever seen the movie The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, the bad guy in the movie says to Lemus, we won't need evidence. We will have your confession. Almost like he's Kang Sheng. But he continued in this vein. He was thrown out by Mao again after the Marshall Mission was done. In late 1946, he was relieved of his duties and had probably been de facto relieved before that. And so intelligence was conducted in a rational way between 1946 and 1965. But then along comes the Cultural Revolution, and Deng Xiaoping is displaced on the Politburo as the political overseer of CCP intelligence, and he's replaced by Kang Sheng. And then all of a sudden, dozens of people are gone from the leadership. Off they go to labor in the countryside, or maybe worse. And the only survivor is this character, Luo Qingchang, who was a brilliant analyst, was known for his encyclopedic knowledge of the enemy during the revolution and during the anti-Japanese war, World War II. And he is also a Cultural Revolution beneficiary par excellence. He was close to Jiang Qing and the left, and somehow he survived the Cultural Revolution, and that somehow is really interesting for the modern day, because even now, in spite of the fact that he was a Cultural Revolution beneficiary and would logically have been thrown out by 1979, he survived all the way until 1983, first of all. Deng Xiaoping apparently couldn't get rid of him until there was a reorganization and the Ministry of State Security was formed, and then there was a good reason to chuck him out and put in somebody who was a little bit more professional. But even today, Luo Qingchang remains, he's deceased now, he died a couple of years ago, but he retains a good reputation. There's nothing that can be seen anywhere on the web that criticizes him. There have probably been some things written. I think I've seen one of them, a samizdat type manuscript that criticizes him, which I'm hoping to use in the next book. But other than that, the CCP is silent about his probable crimes during that time. And even though the CCP expelled Kang Sheng, and they expelled many other senior people who turned against their comrades in the revolution, for some reason, he's still a hero. And this may indicate the extent that leftism has not actually been erased in the Communist Party.
So now that we're coming closer to the modern era, let's talk about some of the themes that sort of defined the first 30 or so years. You write that autarkic self-reliance policies under Mao after 1949 isolated China's intelligence services, and domestic spying never needed the sophistication required in Soviet or Western blocs. So what did that mean about the sort of professional development of these spies?
There was a concern that the intelligence services should not be used in the same overarching way as the KGB was used by Stalin, and indeed the way they were used all the way up until the end of the Soviet Union. That is, that they had this wide-ranging set of responsibilities everywhere. They controlled the borders. They did internal policing. Their different directorates had many different functions, and of course they had the Foreign Intelligence Service as well. However, with foreign intelligence for the CCP, they kept a leash on it. They didn't do much internally. They were employed overseas, and they were largely in embassies, but they were also running some very successful operations like the Jin Wudai, the Larry Wu Tai-chin operation, which lasted all the way from 1947 until he retired from a part of the CIA in 1983, and he was caught in 1985. But they were limited. They did not have the reach that they have today. And I can't really explain much beyond that. I think that requires a lot more study to more fully understand.
So, Matt, before we go into Reform and Opening Era, we can't miss talking about the Princess Kashmir bombing case, which I learned about for the first time in your book. So what the hell was going on with this?
That's a great controversy today. And what was going on was that the nationalists had the brilliant idea that they would assassinate Zhou Enlai by putting a bomb aboard an Indian airliner that was going to take Zhou Enlai from Hong Kong first to Jakarta and then to Bandung for the Bandung Conference in 1955. Partly because they'd wanted to get Zhou Enlai for a long time and were looking for an opportunity, and they didn't have much on the mainland. Their operations on the mainland were almost nil. They were all caught very early on, and when they tried to drop in agents in eastern China, they all failed. It was like the British trying to go into Albania. It just didn't work out. They're all compromised before they got anywhere. They saw this opportunity, and apparently CCP intelligence learned about it, and Zhou Enlai changed his travel plans. But for reasons that are still unclear, maybe having to do with a cold-blooded measurement of return on investment, so to speak, deciding that they didn't want to have sources and methods compromised, perhaps. They decided to let that flight go ahead.
Or the potential like PR gain of these evil nationalists killing folks, right?
Yes, that's certainly a possibility as well. And so they let it go. Zhou's personal driver was on board that plane that went down over the ocean. And so were a bunch of Chinese press correspondents and foreign correspondents. Foreigners who were foreign correspondents as well were killed, and most of the crew was killed in that thing. So the bomb was placed in one of the engines. The pilot lost control as he was trying to ditch into the ocean. And I think all but 3 people were killed in that crash. So there's been a lot of writing about this. We tried to summarize it in the book. The communist side has ignored the critical element here that Zhou Enlai changed his mind and got on and changed his travel plans and went ahead with this, even though they knew what was going on. And in the accounts written by the communist side, they just skip past this and ignore the obvious contradiction. You know, if you knew about this, why didn't you just stop the flight and save a bunch of lives? So, yeah, it is certainly possible, not only that they wanted to avoid compromising sources and methods, but as you say, that they wanted a propaganda win. And indeed, when Zhou Enlai was at the Bandung conference, everybody wanted to see him and touch him and listen to what he had to say at a much, much higher rate of attention, in part because of this incident.
So let's take us closer to the present day. So how does the rebuilding process go over the next few decades after Deng gets in charge?
It wasn't bad, but it was also marked with corruption. And that gradually built up, of course, as reform and opening picked up and business opportunities also picked up. There were opportunities for corruption. But the impetus to start a new organization in 1983, and Zhao Ziyang, who was then premier, if I recall correctly, he was the one who gave the speech at the meeting where this was proposed. And he said, there are so many foreigners coming to China now, and there's so many people who want to spy on us that we have to change direction. We have to coordinate this stuff better. We need a Ministry of State Security to take care of this. And it's called state security in English, I think, for a good reason. Now, the Chinese now like to call it their Ministry of National Security, but I think that's a misnomer, because state security is one thing, national security is another. When we think of national security, we think of foreign threats and protecting our interests overseas and the safety of our citizens and our borders and that sort of thing. But state security, I think, is what the Chinese are thinking of, and that's a little bit different. Peter Mattis has written about this, and several other people have too. State security is a bit different, and that is the security of the Communist Party's rule, the security of the state itself against internal enemies. We're a lot less focused on internal enemies around here. People tend to swear an oath to the Constitution and actually tend to mean it, with a few exceptions here and there. But in China, they're really concerned with prolonging the rule of the Communist Party. And that's where state security comes in. And that indeed was the primary focus of work for MSS, was protecting the state against the party state, against internal enemies and enemies that come from outside and want to subvert the Communist Party's rule. So they did a pretty reasonable job at that. And indeed, going all the way back to the Yan'an period, certainly, areas occupied by the Chinese Communist Party and indeed the People's Republic itself have always been an extremely hard target for foreign espionage, in part because of the social organization that comes with a successful CCP rule over society. And they did a great job. They were catching spies right and left. The Americans managed some successes, certainly. Yu Changsheng, for example, the man who was a mole inside of the new MSS and gave the Americans clues that led to the apprehension of Larry Wu Tai-chin, was an exception. And you can't avoid those sorts of things. There have to be some successes here and there. And indeed, if you read James Lilly's book, China Hand, he hints at some successes in the 80s and into the 90s.
Yeah, that one made no sense. I was really confused because this guy's bragging about, oh yeah, we're doing these dead drops, and you're like the only white person walking around Beijing. It seemed pretty hard for him. I mean, I read that little bit and was a little skeptical of his claims. But
actually, it can be done. I believe that Mr. Lilly was giving us a correct impression, because you've heard the term Moscow rules, and for some reason I've never heard any term like Beijing rules, but there have been successes, and they have to do with adapting to the circumstances. A really good book that I think gets into some... There have been no equivalents written about China, because for some reason, probably having to do with money, bilateral trade and all that, we don't get very much about China and spying and so forth in public. But there have been cases that illustrate that it's possible to run agents under these very difficult circumstances. For example, a really good book I'd recommend is David Hoffman's The $1 Billion Spy, which was about the CIA running a man who gave them information about Soviet defense systems for a long time. And there's stories in here, for example, about a group of 4 people, 2 CIA officers, 2 spouses, getting into a car. And they have that famous blow-up, pop-up doll device, whatever it's called, that sits in the front seat and looks like a person. So they go around a corner, and they're being followed by the KGB, of course. They go around a corner, they come to a screeching halt, the man in the passenger seat gets out, and up comes the blow-up spy doll. And then off they go. And he hides in a doorway, and the KGB goes past him, and hey presto, he's out there not being tailed, and he goes to his agent meeting. So they've developed these sorts of things, and of course these spy versus spy competitions go on, and they managed to have some successes. Now, of course, in 2010 to 2012, something north of 20 people who were CIA agents, that is, spies being run by CIA officers, local people, were rounded up and shot in the back of the head by the Chinese side, which is an interesting thing. Beyond the tragedy itself, it's very interesting that the Chinese side sees spying as this existential threat that must be stamped out with all cruelty and efficiency. Whereas in this country and in other Western countries, spies are a nuisance. We catch them, we put them in jail. We even have a prominent individual who is running an organization that advocates for helping people who are spies to come out of the closet, confess, and be treated with leniency, the noir.usa. We view it as something where somebody should be put in jail and reformed and then released, or maybe traded away to the other side. But the Chinese want to stamp them out, which is a legacy of the revolution.
So another legacy of the revolution is this sort of tension between red versus expert, which we've talked about a little bit in the Cultural Revolution context. But you write that intel units are bastions of faith in the CCP to the detriment of their effectiveness. And unlike in the West, where intelligence organizations, for the most part, are sort of positivist and just trying to understand what's going on around the world, the analysis that goes on within the CCP is more Marxist, where the goal is to find stuff that confirms whatever you already believe about your theory of, the central global contradictions and how you expect them to be resolved. So how is this dynamic played out?
I think it's just as much of a human thing as it is a Chinese communist thing. And the reason I say that is that here in the United States, for example, there are things that a politician must say in public and there are things that they might say in private that if they become public become scandalous, even if they are realistic things, because we're a democracy and we have voters who are lightly informed in many cases, and these lightly informed voters are offended sometimes if you talk too realistically about international affairs. But in China, the sort of equivalent, and I don't want to say that they're the same at all, but the human equivalent is that in party circles, Marxist values are sacrosanct. And so the reporting that comes out of the intelligence community has to recognize these sacred cows. They have to recognize the inevitable decline of capitalism, this sort of thing, the triumph of socialist values once people are shown the way. And so when intelligence analysis is done, they have to recognize these sacred cows, and they can't really stray beyond them. However, Peter's done some work where he has found that some of the reporting is done semi-privately. That is, that an analyst will give a minister a eyes-only type intelligence analysis that is a little bit more realistic. As well, what the MSS does is they try to, we have an example in the book, they try to recruit people to write analyses for them on questions that they're interested in, and that isn't always to suborn them and blackmail them and turn them into agents against their own countries. Sometimes it's just to get an unvarnished opinion that they can present as a foreign view. And indeed,
I did think that one was really funny. There was some ex-army intel officer or something, and then he was getting like $1,500 checks to write 10-page reports, which 10 other think tanks they could just Google for this sort of information, which is enough to land you in jail if you are selling that analysis to the party. So everyone, all your listeners out there, be wary of your LinkedIn inboxes, because you never know who might be on the other side of your surprisingly unlucrative consulting arrangement. This is one of the things that struck out to me is like just the fact that how cheap they seem to be for some of these operations.
I'm sure they have a budget like everybody else, and they have a quota of production quota that they need to meet, and the budget that they need to fulfill it within. Yeah, it's an interesting situation, and again, it doesn't always mean that somebody's being suborned into and blackmailed into being a traitor. But I would say one thing about LinkedIn, and that is, as an author, I accept all LinkedIn invitations. But I am careful. I don't care if there are 10 MSS agents on my LinkedIn, among my LinkedIn connections, and the things that I post on LinkedIn are intended to be public. They're not intended to be for any select audience. However, of course, I'm very careful about any proposals sent to me. But people don't send me proposals. I think they seem to understand that I'm not in the market for that.
So, Matt, let's talk a little bit about economic espionage. You write that the 10,000 grains of sand thing is really not the right analytical frame to understand what the CCP is doing on this regard.
Yeah, and just for people who haven't heard this interesting tale, so there was an FBI agent named Paul Moore, not agent, but an analyst who was once head of analysis for China. I actually met him once when I was getting ready to go to China with the Foreign Commercial Service. But anyway, his idea, his hypothesis was that, to put it in a sort of a story, was that if the Chinese, the Russians, and the Americans wanted to know about the composition of sand on a beach, the Americans would send in satellites to take pictures. Nowadays, they would send in drones to scoop up some sand. The Russians would send a Spetsnaz team at 3 o'clock in the morning to land on the beach, take some samples, and go back to the submarine and take it off to Moscow. The Chinese would somehow send 10,000 tourists to the beach, and they would have a lovely time, and then they'd fold up their umbrellas and go back to Beijing and shake out their sand, shake out their beach towels, and they'd have all the sand that they wanted. And one of the reasons that he came up with this was Chinese side spies like everybody else when it comes to professional operations. Although they have some missions that are unique, such as technology acquisition. But the thing is that they sort of give a letter of marque from the king. They give a deputization to state-owned enterprises to go out and steal their own technology. And they also do not make it against the law in any way for Chinese citizens to go in for their own entrepreneurial operations, to steal some technology here in the United States, for example, take it back to China and start their own business, or take it back to China and work for a Chinese company. So I think this is where that grains of sand idea comes from. Way back when I was working for the Commerce Department in Washington in the late 80s and early 90s, I hate to date myself, even then there was the feeling that U.S. law enforcement and counterintelligence officials were overwhelmed by the number of Chinese people who seemed to be doing these things. And it's been the same complaint over and over again for decades. And for some reason, the people in Congress have decided to not address this topic. And now we have the head of the FBI saying we're opening up the case concerning China in the United States once every 10 or 12 hours. And still we are without sufficient resources, apparently. So this is where that idea comes from. And it's interestingly illustrated in 2 videos put out by the FBI. One of the videos is called Game of Pawns. That's like in chess.
Oh yeah, this one was really bad.
It was cheesy and it wasn't completely accurate. It was a dramatization, but it does show a process by professional intelligence officers to recruit an American who is in China, which is often the way it's done, because if you're in China, of course, everything's under control. You don't have to worry about counter surveillance, et cetera. And so that's the professional side, as depicted by the FBI, as they gloriously solve the case near the end. But the other one is called Company Man, another FBI video, starring the same bad guy who was the spy master in Game of Pawns. He also plays the one of the bad guys in Company Man. And this one is about an amateurish attempt by a Chinese state-owned enterprise to steal fireproof glass technology from a company in New York. Now, let's see, who does glass in upstate New York? Could it be Corning? It seems like it was Corning. And that operation was ridiculous. They picked out some people who were engineers, and they found a guy who hadn't been promoted lately. And without checking his background or taking much time at all, they just gave him a rather blunt approach and said, come to China and get lots of money.
Right.
And so he reported this, of course, to his corporate security office, and the FBI was brought in, and these 2 people who were not nearly as clever as they are depicted in the video, were busted by the Bureau. So there's that. And another interesting case, which I think is just going to trial now, is the case of Xu Yanjun, the Jiangsu State Security Bureau deputy chief of the 6th section of the Bureau, was running a fairly decent operation where he was trying to get the secrets of carbon blade fan technology for extra hot, extra fast engines from General Electric, that is aircraft engines. And this is something the Chinese have been trying to do for decades, to get that particular technology. Because, if jet engine is burning really hot because it's fast, if you don't cool those fan blades, they melt. And engineering them to do that, if they're metal, is a real challenge. But the carbon fan blade technology apparently allowed that to be done in a much simpler way, or allows it. So Xu corresponded by email with several people, apparently. The actual number seems to be unknown. Brought one or two of them to China, I think one guy in particular, to China to lecture about carbon fan blade technology, and then proposed that they meet in a third country, Belgium. What a choice. They meet in Belgium, and he would bring his company computer, his laptop, with him, and they would get a hard drive and copy everything from his hard drive onto this other hard drive and go home to Beijing and have all these GE secrets of how to design these engines. Bad country to pick. Should have gone to Hong Kong, or maybe, I don't know, Malaysia, where there's less of a close intelligence relationship with the United States, because probably this was detected, I think, by our good friends at Fort Meade, Maryland, the NSA. I'm just guessing here, that they figured this out, reported it, gave it to the Bureau, and then liaison was made. And when Xu landed in Belgium, he was nabbed and quickly sent to the United States. And interestingly, the Chinese side did not make a big deal out of this. But then there's the case of Ms. Meng, who is the CFO of Huawei, who was caught in Canada and still is yet to be extradited to the US. And there, of course, it's a propaganda feast that's being had by the Chinese side to depict her as a innocent victim and all that, even though there's apparently good evidence of financial fraud against U.S. law. But that's not a spy case. That's something different.
So coming back to government-affiliated videos, do you have favorite Chinese TV series or movies that covers the sorts of themes we've been talking about today?
Yeah, there are a couple. State Secrets is one of them, which can be found on YouTube. I don't remember the proper names at the moment, but they're easy to find if you search on the Chinese characters Guojia Mimi, State Secrets. Then you come up with a couple of them. One of them is set in the modern day, and it's all about state security officers catching Chinese people who are spying for foreign powers. And sometimes they'll show, for example, a Chinese man talking on the phone, and at the other end there's another Chinese man, and he's standing in front of the Tower of London, this sort of thing, and giving away secrets over the phone. And the other one is set in, there's several actually that are set in the Revolution. And that's interesting because it reflects what is going on with the discussion in public about espionage. And that is that it's focused on the Revolution, and it's showing people, patriotic people, fighting against the Japanese, struggling against the corrupt, vile Kuomintang enemy, this sort of thing. And that carries over to the one or two modern day type series where people are struggling against corrupt and vile internal enemies who would betray China, who would be Hanjian race traitors, and Pantu, or renegades spying for Taiwan, that sort of thing.
So Matt, let's do a few minutes on supercomputers. How about it?
So supercomputers are a very interesting topic. Nowadays, supercomputers are typically constructed using parallel processing, which means that you arrange CPUs, central processing units, made particularly by Intel, but also by AMD, and GPUs, graphics processing units, made most prominently by NVIDIA, although they're also made by Intel. You arrange them in parallel. Arranging circuitry in parallel is something you learn when you first take any course on electronics. And so the bottom line there is that usually thousands of these CPUs, prominently the Intel Xeon 12-core, I think it's called E5 CPU, with 12 cores, that is with 12 equivalent CPUs on the chip itself, are arranged and they build these supercomputers. According to the website Top 500, 96% of all supercomputers depend on Intel processors. And NVIDIA GPUs also play a prominent role when it comes to artificial intelligence. There are over 200 of these world-class supercomputers in China now, again, according to Top 500. And they're used for many things. They're used to forecast the weather. They're used, particularly if you bring in artificial intelligence and GPUs, the graphics processors, they're used for biomedical purposes to diagnose breast cancer. So this is something that's also used, of course, for military purposes to simulate nuclear explosions, so you don't have to do so much nuclear testing to develop your nuclear weapons. They're used for designing missiles, and they're used in cryptography, in particular to either construct cryptographic solutions to keep your communications secret or to attack cryptographic solutions like NSA does, right? And so supercomputers are now an important element not only in those spheres, but also in chasing after people who have an ethnic profile of some sort, particularly Uyghurs and Tibetans. And so there's been a lot of, not a lot of publicity, but at least some publicity on that score in the last couple of years. And the most interesting essay that I've read lately, there are two of them. They're both in the book China's Quest for Foreign Technology Beyond Espionage that was just published by Routledge. It's edited by William Hannes and Didi Kirsten Tatlow. Again, that's China's Quest for Foreign Technology. It's the most interesting one regarding supercomputers and the use of them in finding Uyghurs, finding a Tibetan in a crowd, is by Dahlia Peterson. It's called Foreign Technology and the Surveillance State. And she documents using Chinese sources where people have written in China about the glories of NVIDIA GPUs and Intel CPUs. She documents how this infrastructure to track people by ethnicity has been built in Xinjiang. And it gives us a peek, I think, into the future of what China will look like, how this sort of activity will proceed. Back in the Obama administration, in I think it was August of 2014, they initiated controls because before that, anybody could sell practically anything to any consignee in China, including a military consignee, to build a supercomputer. That included Intel. And these Xeon processors, for example, at the retail level, they sell right now for $800 or $900 each, which is a typical price. Of course, through the channels to computer manufacturers and other big purchasers, they cost less, about half as much probably, maybe $400 or $500 each. Well, you do the math, and $400 or $500 times 1,000 or 2,000 for the number of CPUs that go into a supercomputer is big revenue. And so that was allegedly controlled in 2014, 2015 by the Obama administration, where they required an export license to make such a sale to China that would have to be considered before it was granted. The Trump administration has tried to control it too, but I'm not seeing evidence that the sales have actually stopped.
华尔街简报，中国前海军司令部中校参谋傅晓田应是隶属军方间谍。美国之音报道，8·1建军节前夕，中国国家主席习近平正式晋升前海军副司令王厚斌、前南部战区空军政委徐希胜出任火箭军的司令员和政委。对此跨军种的主观任命，部分军事专家说，恐坐实了火箭军遭美国情报监测反泄密的传闻，也代表习近平大失军心，火箭军已战力大损。但也有专家指出， 海、空军高官空降火箭军或代表习近平以朝三军核武统一直管部署，以扩大中国的核震慑力。中国火箭军高层近来频传遭整肃。综合南华早报等媒体报道，前司令员李玉超和他的前后任副手刘光斌、张振中传出因涉及贪腐已被带走调查。另外，火箭军前副司令吴国华也传出6月初上吊自杀，但中国媒体澎湃新闻在他去世3周后才引述解放军内部的通报称，死因为脑溢血猝死。消息见报后一度冲上微博热搜榜，引发中国网民议论纷纷。美国打赢情报战，火箭军情资一手握。火箭军前高官分传落马之际，中国国防部透过新闻稿发布，习近平于7月31日正式任命王厚斌和徐锡胜出任火箭军的司令员和政委。换言之，李玉超和徐忠波已被免职。对此发展，位于美国洛杉矶的前中共海军司令部中校参谋姚成在接受美国之音采访时表示，坐实了火箭军高层向美国情报单位泄密后，引发习近平严查的种种传闻，调查范围扩及火箭军战略支援部队及刚被免职的前外长秦刚。姚成研判，此次中共的反贪调查恐源自美国空军大学去年10月底公布的中国火箭军结构报告。该报告上从火箭军司令部下至炊事班乃至基地坐标都遭披露，若非火箭军高层泄密，美国的情报搜集恐无法如此全面。他分析，此报告公开后，中共肯定严查，也疑似破获了美国中情局在中国一个30人规模的间谍网，这恐是美国中情局局长伯恩斯 William Burns 5月之所以秘密出访北京的原因之一。姚成说，知情人士向他透露，应是李玉超的儿子向美国泄露了火箭军的机密资料，导致李玉超从会议室被带走接受调查，并牵扯到作为中国情报首脑机构的战略支援部队，连司令员居干生也被带走调查，只不过他是因为泄密还是贪腐问题被查，无从确认。婚外情、腐败不够看，泄密才是大事。姚成说，中国军方的人事内幕很难证实，但合理推测，因为泄密事件发生在美国，所以前外长秦刚在驻美大使期间的婚外情因泄密案调查曝了光，再加上他的绯闻对象凤凰卫视主持人傅晓田应是隶属军方的情报人员，所以秦刚恐还在接受调查中。他说，这一系列事件串在一起，就是泄密问题、婚外情、腐败都不是大事，而且火箭军是美国情报工作的重点。姚成说，他解放军的海空军不占优势，而且处于劣势，他唯一能拿出手对对方有威胁的就是火箭军导弹，美国情报工作的重点就放在火箭军这一块，因为火箭军一旦打起来，他对美国本土有威胁，所以他们美国花大量的时间精力在弄火箭军，最后把火箭军的资料弄出来，一方面是数据情报，第二方面也有策反的嫌疑。也因此，姚成怀疑，若吴国华如他的老长官太子党张晓阳所透露的，是在家中3楼上吊自杀，他寻短背后的隐情恐涉及泄密，甚至被美国策反等更重大的情节，否则身为中共情报的大头目之一，吴国华何苦自我了结？海空军入主火箭军，统一核武指挥权。中国的政治运作太不透明，针对解放军人士的臆测难免分传，但位于台北的中华战略学会资深研究员张静提醒，不应忽视习近平派任海空军将领领导火箭军的严肃性。他说，中国火箭军迟早要跟海空军的战略打击部队和反击在台或指挥体系进行整合，达成3合1统一指挥的核武战略，相当于美国核导弹的统一用兵指挥作战策略 Single Integrated Operational Plan。 张静告诉美国之音，中共将海军跟空军的核反击武力跟核打击武力加以整合，这是必然的趋势。我基本上推断，海空军相关核武部队的幕僚老早就已经进入火箭军的相关幕僚体系里任职，所以当他逐渐成熟，可以均衡掌握全局的时候，才有高层人士王厚斌、徐锡胜的调动。他们总算向3合1统一指挥的核武迈进了。张静说，解放军的指挥和政工体系都曾出现跨军种或跨兵种的交叉任职，所以海军出身的王厚斌和空军出身的徐锡胜入主火箭军并不稀奇，但他们两人若具有核导弹部队及空军轰炸机部队的背景，对于习近平部署3军核武的统一指挥管制权将是更明朗的方向。多元核下阻力下，习近平优军队忠诚度。夏威夷太平洋论坛 Pacific Forum 位于新加坡的分析师亚历山大·尼尔 Alexander Neil 也同意，习近平试图将陆基式的核导弹延伸到可从空中或海上发射，这将建构出现代化的核下阻武力。因此，此一最新军事部署应比他在党内发动的反贪腐调查更重要。尼尔告诉美国之音，现在的发展是为了建构现代化、有效率的核下阻武力，解放军要打造所谓的核武3位一体。 也就是从3个方位达成核导弹的核下阻力。此战略更多是将核武器放上战机、潜艇，而非单靠陆基型导弹。尼尔说，美苏冷战时期，2大核武国家比拼的是谁有更多从陆地发射的核导弹，但进入现代化的核武对峙，更激进、具攻击性的核实力将是具有可以从空中、海上和陆地上发射核武的多元下阻力，让对手猜不透下一波核武攻击将从何处突袭。不过，尼尔说，中国的核武力越强，习近平就越需要确认军队对他和共产党的绝对忠诚。但解放军的贪腐问题根深蒂固，习近平10年内在党内发动了共计4波的反贪调查，一方面清党，一方面也为自己整肃异议，但贪腐和向心力对他仍是难题。姚成、王厚斌镇不住火箭军。前中共海军司令部中校参谋姚成认为，习近平在军中回天无力，他厉行反腐，但选择性抓了200-300人，把军人都得罪光了。另外，他推行的军改更是败笔，只为抓权，未从战斗力的角度考量，因此一批将军们都憋住一股气，根本不会听他指挥出兵打仗。姚成还说，王厚斌和他在军中是老乡，关系很好。他断言，业务能力中下的王厚斌不可能镇得住火箭军，而且火箭军是高科技军种，涉及太空、卫星和导弹技术都不是王厚斌能马上上手的。另外，习近平放逐火箭军内上百位将军不内生，也代表他对整个火箭军的不信任。姚成说，王厚斌这个人的优点听话，会揣摩领导的意图，他的缺点是他是参谋出身，他没有带过兵，他一直在机关，他也没有专业，基本上他就是靠着听话上来的。他到火箭军去，不可能镇得住火箭军。首先，他不懂业务，军队不服你，糊弄你，看不起你，所以不要指望着他到了火箭军能改光火箭军，改不了。但是呢，他会保他的乌纱帽。他听话，这是中共现在最突出的一个特点，就是用奴才，不用人才。据公开资料，1961年出生的王厚斌曾任总参谋部办公厅综合研究室主任、东海舰队副参谋长兼舟山基地副司令员。他于2016年初担任海军南海舰队参谋长，后上调海军总部，出任海军副参谋长。他于2018年底升任海军副司令员。下一则新闻，美国企业对中国的商业信心降至3年低点。日经亚洲报道，根据美国华南商会的一份报告，美国公司对中国的信心降至3年来的最低点。该调查涵盖了185家公司，发现60%的公司对中国的增长前景持乐观或稍微乐观态度，这是自2020年以来的最低水平。尽管92%的受访者表示已经在某种程度上或完全从疫情中恢复过来，但31%的公司在2022年下半年由于订单取消和迁移而经历了收入下降。这种谨慎情绪也反映在今年公司在中国的预算在投资计划中。下一则新闻，中国的大型科技公司在北京政府积极的政策转变后进入扩张模式。南华早报报道，中国的主要科技公司正在加大招聘力度，并考虑新的收购，因为北京的监管打击即将结束。互联网平台运营商现在能够投资新的发展项目，从而增加招聘计划。美团、快手科技、米哈游、字节跳动、京东、拼多多和阿里巴巴近几个月宣布了新的职位空缺。尽管去年有裁员，但这些公司仍是中国最大的雇主之一。中国政府已经表示支持科技行业的扩张，但需要采取具体措施，如低息贷款和税收减免，以确保增长。下一则新闻，独家，中国要求一些银行减少或延迟购买美元。消息人士，路透社报道。据报道，中国的货币监管机构已指示一些商业银行减少或延迟购买美元，以减缓人民币贬值。此举是当局今年采取的一系列措施之一，旨在支持人民币，因为中国经济复苏和美元及其他主要货币的收益率上升对人民币造成了打击。人民币对美元的汇率今年以来已贬值 3.6%， 成为亚洲表现最差的货币之一。下一则新闻，中国军队加速准备封锁台湾。日经亚洲报道，根据日经新闻的分析，自纳尔西、佩洛西1年前访问台湾以来，中国模拟遏制台湾的军事演习大幅增加。在佩洛西访问之前，中国的军机和军舰很少向东移动，主要在台湾西南方进行活动。然而，在过去的1年里，他们在西太平洋地区活动更加频繁，而台湾位于其西侧。自3月以来，中国军机在台湾东部的空中活动急剧增加，该地区的俄罗斯军事活动也变得明显。专家们认为，中国正在为近期封锁台湾做最后准备。台湾一直在安装密集的雷达网络，并在沙滩上进行军事演习，以防止中国军队的登陆。台湾军方已确定了14个可能的中国军队登陆的门槛，包括台北港和桃园的沙滩。 包括日本、菲律宾和韩国在内的台湾邻国正在密切监视局势，并增强了对中国军事活动的应对能力。美国也扩大了与台湾的合作，包括军事支持和在岛上驻扎额外的军事人员。然而，还有一些挑战需要解决，例如美国向台湾交付武器的延迟和与乌克兰的交易优先问题。分析指出，中国的军事能力的提升和迅速入侵台湾的可能性是台湾军方及其盟友的主要关注点。下一则新闻，俄罗斯表示将扩大金砖5国集团成为即将召开的峰会的重要议题。加拿大环球邮报报道，克里姆林宫表示，扩大金砖国家集团将是即将在南非举行的峰会的关键议题。南非已经收到来自40多个其他国家加入该集团的兴趣，该集团旨在平衡美国和西方的影响力。克里姆林宫承认了关于扩大该集团的辩论，并将其视为该联盟日益增长的权威的一个迹象。俄罗斯已加强与中国、印度和其他国家的联系，以回应对其在乌克兰进行军事行动后西方国家实施的制裁。普京总统将不参加峰会，因为国际刑事法院对其在乌克兰被指控犯有战争罪行而发出了逮捕令。下一则新闻，软实力：中国共产党的语言扩张席卷中东地区。国会山报报道，伊朗、沙特阿拉伯和土耳其都采取了重要步骤，将汉语纳入其教育体系。这是中国在中东和世界其他地区推广其语言和文化的更广泛计划的一部分。华盛顿审查者报的阿麦德·哈什米在一篇专栏中写道，作者认为，普通话在该地区的扩张是中国主导的文明、文化和地缘政治举措的一部分。这是中国民族主义和习近平主席的中国化政策推动的。作者认为，这一趋势是美国不能忽视的。下一则新闻，美国禁止从另外2家位于中国的公司进口，原因是这些公司涉嫌使用维吾尔族劳工。国会山报报道，美国国土安全部 DHS 宣布，由于2家中国公司使用强迫劳工，他们已被列入美国制裁名单。这2家公司分别是一家汽车电池制造商和一家食品添加剂公司，他们被发现在中国新疆省使用强迫维吾尔族劳工。此举是美国政府为了追究中国对待维吾尔人的责任而采取的行动，这被称为种族灭绝。根据维吾尔强迫劳动预防法，目前已有24家中国公司受到制裁。中国政府在过去10年中一直针对维吾尔族少数民族进行打压，有报道称存在大规模关押和再教育营。美国谴责这些行动，并致力于在全球范围内根除强迫劳工。下一则新闻，DeSantis 表示，如果当选，他将考虑全国禁止 TikTok。国会山报报道，共和党总统候选人罗恩·德桑提斯对中国所有的视频分享应用抖音 TikTok 的安全漏洞表示担忧，并表示如果当选，他将考虑全国禁止该应用。然而，德桑提斯还强调，他不会支持像限制法案这样的立法。该法案旨在赋予联邦政府更多权力来监管和禁止与外国对手有关的技术。今年早些时候，德桑提斯在佛罗里达州签署了一项法案，禁止在政府和学校服务器和设备上使用抖音，以此来遏制中国共产党在该州的影响力。下一则新闻，中国掌握停止朝鲜第7次核试验的关键。外交官报道，中国应该遣返朝鲜工人，以遏制朝鲜的核野心。中国东北亚研究协会主任金亮祥在一篇专栏文章中如是说。金亮祥认为，中国对朝鲜核导弹计划的支持是由于中国对朝鲜工人的立场，这些工人被剥削以获取硬通货来支持朝鲜政权。金亮祥说，这些工人的遣返将向平壤发出强烈信号，危及其核计划，并改善中国与美国和韩国的关系。下一则新闻，万豪酒店在中国需求回升的推动下提高了年度利润。路透社报道，万豪国际酒店集团提高了全年利润预测，因为它预计房间价格上涨和中国需求复苏将推动收益增长。该酒店运营商报告了第2季度收入为60.8亿美元，超过分析师对59.9亿美元的预期。万豪每可用房间的收入同比增长 13.5%， 国际房间收入增长 39%， 受中国复苏的推动。该公司将全年房间增长预测从之前的 4% 至 4.5% 提高至 6.4% 至 6.7%。该酒店运营商还预计将从与赌场运营商美高梅国际度假村的许可协议中受益。下一则新闻，胡佛研究所发布了一份关于全球半导体安全的新报告。胡佛研究所报道，胡佛研究所推出了一份名为《硅谷三角洲：美国、台湾、中国和全球半导体安全》的新报告。该报告研究了全球半导体行业，重点关注美国、台湾和中国。他强调了半导体对全球经济的重要性以及其生产对国家安全的影响。报告还讨论了中国在半导体市场上主导地位的努力， 以及美国在半导体生产方面发展韧性的需求。报告还提出了解决全球半导体安全挑战和风险的政策建议。下一则新闻：美中重新接触的夏天可以成为整个世界的胜利。国会山报报道，根据总统国家基础设施咨询委员会成员萨德克·瓦巴的一篇专栏文章，美国和中国必须追求一种有选择性的激进竞争与合作政策。他认为，两国正处于关系的关键时刻，可能朝着几个不同的方向发展，包括对抗，这将是灾难性的。相反，美国应该通过精细的经济国家 CRAFT、有力的贸易协议和战略投资来带领盟国。瓦巴以美国、日本和荷兰对中国芯片制造能力的限制为例，这种限制措施有助于限制中国在国家安全关键领域的主导地位。他还举了福特、印尼巴勒和中国浙江华油钴业共同建设印尼电动汽车电池工厂的联盟为例。瓦巴得出结论，投资美国并压住美国是美国在与中国的战略竞争中最重要的事情。下一则新闻：前美国国务院中国事务高级官员加入欧亚集团。路透社报道，美国国务院前中国政策高级官员里克·沃特斯已加入咨询公司欧亚集团，担任中国区总经理。沃特斯在今年6月辞去职务，将在华盛顿办公，并利用自己深厚的分析能力和与中国官方谈判的经验，帮助客户应对中国与世界的复杂关系。沃特斯曾领导国务院的中国办公室政策部门，该部门旨在制定政策，以应对中国在挑战美国及其盟友的地区的影响力。华尔街简报